Hi everyone, Miss Nelson here, back with another lesson. And today, our objective is what are tides and why do they occur? To start off our lesson, I want you to think about what direction does the Hudson River flow? So maybe at one point you guys have been to Getty Square, stood on the dock, and looked at the Hudson River. Imagine, which way does it flow? Does it flow south or does it flow north? Do you have your answer in your head? Well, the true answer is both. It flows in both directions. Now you might be thinking, how is that possible for a river to flow in both directions? And the answer has everything to do with tides, which is what we are going to be talking about today. So, what are tides? Well, the definition is the cyclic rise and fall of ocean water on Earth caused by the gravitational attraction of the moon and to a lesser degree the sun. Now that's a long definition, so we're going to take it in parts. The first part that we're going to look at is the cyclic rise and fall of ocean water. Here I have a time-lapse video showing the tides. Let's watch. Alright, so as we're watching this video, you can see that at first everyone's able to walk around this area, but slowly that water rises higher and higher and higher to the point where no one can walk there, but people can boat. Then it goes back down again and people can walk again. If this video continued further for the day, we would see that it would go back up again and back down again. And then the next day, back up again, down again, back up again, down again. The next day, back up again, down again. You get the point. That is why we call it cyclic, is it happens over and over and over again. That's what cyclic means. We have this rise and fall of ocean water. And it turns out that anywhere on Earth near the ocean that you go, you will find tides. You will see that anywhere on Earth that you go, there will be a low tide when the water level is low, and a high tide when it's high. In fact, a low tide, a high tide, a low tide, high tide each day. Literally anywhere on Earth you go, by the ocean you will see this low and high tide. And this is why the Hudson River flows in both directions. When it is low tide, the Hudson River flows south because the level near the ocean where it's flowing to is low. When that ocean level gets higher, the Hudson River flows north in the opposite direction. But tides are also important because they can affect wildlife. Like, for example, sea turtles can only get to shore uh, to plant their eggs during low tide. Um, it affects fishermen. So if you eat fish or any type of seafood, you can think that the fishermen have knowledge of the tides to catch the type of food you like in the different places. It affects boats and vessels and how they're able to travel so that they don't get run ashore. and it affects flooding, particularly during hurricanes. If a hurricane hits during a high tide, you tend to get way more flooding than if it hits during a low tide. In fact, there is this island in the middle of France called the Mont Saint-Michel, where during low tide, people used to be able to walk to the island. And then during high tide, it would become an island. In fact, people died traveling there because they got stuck during high tide and drowned before they built a road over the water. More personally, this is my sister, Hannah Nelson. She's short hair, but she studies, she's getting a PhD studying marine biology. Her entire life is dictated by the tides because she can only do her research during low tide. So sometimes she'll go do her research at 2 a.m. because that just happens to be when the low tide hits. Now that we've talked about tides and what they are, we need to talk about why do they occur. And to answer this question, we're going to focus on the second part of the definition. Tides occur because they are caused by the gravitational attraction of the moon and to a lesser degree the sun. If you take a look at that diagram, the gravity of the moon pulls the ocean water towards it. And whatever happens on one side is going to happen on the other. So we have that high tide following wherever the moon goes because it's pulling the ocean water towards it. And the low tide will be at a 90-degree angle to where that high tide is. As the Earth rotates underneath it, we get a high tide, a low tide, a high tide, and a low tide. And that's what we experience in a day. So, we have the moon pulling on the ocean water, but there's actually one more thing that pulls on ocean water. And if you look at the definition, you can see what it is. The sun. The sun also pulls on the ocean water, but to a lesser degree. Not as much as the moon. In fact, about 2/3 or 3/4 of the pull is the moon, and 1/3 or 1/4 of the pull is the sun. Why does the moon have a greater effect on tides than the sun? Especially because the sun is so much bigger than the moon. Why is it? Well, the reason is the moon has a greater effect on tides because it is so much closer to the Earth. So its gravitational pull is going to be stronger because it's closer. Alright, now I want you to think, how often do tides occur? Well, if you look up, you can look up the tide forecast, just like how you can look up a weather forecast, and see exactly when the tides are going to occur. But in a sense, you don't really need to do that because it occurs on a predictable pattern. It goes high tides, low tides, high tides, low tides, predictably, kind of like you can see at this graph. So on this graph, we have an entire day from midnight to the next midnight. And on the y-axis, we have the tide height. Take these 4 minutes to try to answer these 4 questions, which if you're looking at the note packet are also, those 4 questions come directly from the next page. If you don't have them, just write them down and see if you can answer the 4 questions in the next 4 minutes. Alright, go for it and then we'll discuss the answers. right, time is up. Let's look at the answers. So, how many high tides occur each day? Well, if you look, the high tides is where the peak of the tidal height. So there are two where those two blue dots are. And question 2, approximately how much time passes between high tides? If we follow those blue dots down, we can see the time they occurred. So the first tide, high tide, occurred at 2 a.m. The second one occurred around 2:30, between that 2 and 3 mark, 2:30 p.m. So the difference is about 12 hours and 30 minutes. How many low tides occur each day? Well, low tides is where these green dots hit, the lowest points in the tidal height. And 2 occurred within the day. And approximately how many hours pass between low tides? We can see that the first low tide occurred around 8:15, and then the second one occurred around 8:45 p.m. So again, that's about 12 hours and 30 minutes difference. The last thing that we're going to talk about is that there's actually 2 different types of tides. The first one is called a spring tide. This occurs when the Earth, Sun, and Moon are all in a straight line, which, if you remember back to our moon phases, that is our new and full moon. Tides are most extreme during this time because the moon and the sun are pulling in the same direction. So we get really high tides and really low tides. The other type of moon phase is called the neap tide. And that occurs when the sun, earth, and moon are at a 90-degree angle. If you remember our moon phases, this would occur during the first quarter and the third quarter moon. And in this case, tides are less extreme because the moon pulls the water in this picture. You can imagine it pulls it up, down, where the sun pulls it from side to side. And so there's really not that big of a difference between the high tide and the low tide, as you can see in this picture. That is called our neap tide. All right. So now we've reached the end of the lesson. If you guys are in the note packet, you'll see that there's a bunch of questions. For your exit ticket, you don't need to answer all of those questions, but for your exit ticket, I want you to focus on question number 9. Question number 9 is, which has more of an effect on tides, the sun or the moon, and explain why. All right, that is the lesson for today. As always, please send a picture of your notes and the exit ticket to Miss Laplaca, and I hope you guys have a good one. Bye!